Welcome to the most recent talk in the Hertie School Democracy Promotion After Afghanistan talk shows. Today we have two very distinguished guests, both specialists in democracy in Asia. Professor Christophe Jaffrelot, who joins us from Sciences Po in Paris, is an expert on India and Pakistan. He wrote extensively on both countries, both in English and in French. He's actually very well traveled among American, US, and French universities, and also a regular columnist to newspapers in India. And he wrote not only on democracy, but in general about these countries, about the caste system, about the political sociology of these countries. On the other hand, Daniela Stockmann is a scholar on digital governance. She has a ERC grant where she actually compares the regulations in digital governance across a number of countries. She is an expert on China. So in fact, in her PhD, she looked at how this is regulated in China. And of course, is a follower of politics in China and the broader region. We do not have an open Q&A session in democracy in democracy promotion series. What we do is that we have a lively chat where we encourage you to put questions, and me and my team were going to follow up these questions and return to you. For those who are for the first time joining us, my name is Alina Mungiu-Pippidi. I am a professor of democracy studies at Hertie School of Governance in Berlin. So welcome to our program, and I'd like to start with the question that concerns everybody these days, even people who are not very knowledgeable on Asia, like some of us here, which is what explains the fact that after these two countries have been presented for many years as a contrasting pair, China and India, but still they had very close positions on these Russian invasions in Ukraine. In other words, they were rather reluctant to join the Western alliance into sanctioning Russia and condemning Russia in very strong terms. We are really curious to know why this happens, and as much as we want to know what is the general impact of all this fantastic reshuffle of the world order, which started with the American retirement from Afghanistan, on the Asian democracy in general, on these two countries, but not only on these two countries. So if I may, Daniela, let me start with you, because I have just seen the news today that China was very nervous that an American destroyer just passed the Taiwan Strait, which happens all the time, by the way. What is actually China's position in all this? Is China waiting to see what happens to take some profit? Where is China really in all this new redesign of the world order?
First of all, let me start by saying thank you for the invitation. I'm thrilled to be here today. So there has been a lot of speculation as to whether China is going to use the opportunity of the Russian-Ukrainian war in order to take Taiwan. In my opinion, and I've been studying China for 25 years now. My first time going to China was in 1997. And I've been focusing on Chinese politics and media ever since. My personal view is that currently China is so much involved in international issues and domestic issues that China is unlikely to take this opportunity in order to go to war regarding the Taiwan issue. So I can talk more, of course, about these domestic reasons, but if there was more proactive activities on the Chinese side, what we would have to see is the movement of troops close to the Taiwan Strait. And so it would have to be very visible to any observers whether China is moving military troops closer to the coastal line across the shore to Taiwan, and at the present we don't see that movement happening.
But that's not our only fear, right? I mean, that would be like the worst scenario. Nobody happens to this to expect today. Okay, it's more like a learning phase. I think that the most pressing fear is that China will actually, if the worst comes to the worst, support Russia if Russia is coming out really badly of all this. Support Russia evade sanctions and support Russia to resist the Western sanctions, because obviously it's not in the interest of China that Western sanctions can change a regime in a country like Russia, is it? And how fearful should we be that China will do more than just not condemn Russia verbally and will actually provide support for Russia to resist sanctions?
Yes, so the signals coming out of China regarding China's position is ambivalent. So on the one hand, so first we need to start with February. So before Russia invaded Ukraine, Russia and China signed an agreement where they committed to friendship. And it is also for cultural reasons in China. It is impossible for a leader like Xi Jinping to it would be a sign of losing face in front of a Chinese society to step down and to agree that he may have made a strategic mistake. So, so there is, from a Chinese perspective, you also need to think about in Chinese politics, Chinese political leaders think differently about how to project China's position abroad. That's called 对外宣传, propaganda towards foreign nations. And then 对内宣传 is how you propagate your views internally. And so internally, China or the Chinese leadership is very much promoting state messages and also managing and controlling other information that would contradict with a more pro-Russian view. So that's one sort of signal that's coming out of China, because obviously Western observers or outside observers are not just looking at the official statements of the Chinese Foreign Ministry, for example, or of Chinese leader speeches. So a lot of, the New York Times, a lot of the reporting is also looking into, what do Chinese official media, how do they talk about the war? And so the internal information that is circulating and that is available to Chinese citizens is very much promoting a pro-Russian version. At the same time, if we look at how China's sort of statements and information regarding its official position, they promote officially the view that they are an objective observer, and they do not sort of to the outside world then take a very pro-Russian stance. So there are ambivalent signals, and I think this is also what the observers are grappling with.
I see. So in the case of China, internal media messages are pro-Russia, and for the rest, China has clearly said that they're also concerned about potential NATO expansion, and they're also concerned about a world conceived as military alliances. They feel threatened by that, so that is another common point with Russia. But Christophe, this is not or should not be at all the case with India. So what explains the ambivalent position that India had on the Russian-Ukrainian war?
Well, in the case of India, I would say three factors need to be mentioned. And it's difficult to know which one is the most important, but I will list them in the following order. Number one, not to alienate Russia, because 70% of India's military equipment come from Russia, including very sophisticated equipment material like S-400. And clearly, India needs Russia, and the visit by Putin in Delhi a few months ago only showed that this is something India values a lot. So that's a very important variable that needs to be factored in. But there is a second explanation that is related to the fact that India doesn't like to take side. India has inherited the legacy of decades of non-alignment, the idea to abstain in a multilateral organization forum like the UN Security Council, where India is now as a non-permanent member, is an old tradition. You know, the number of votes that in fact showed that India did not want to do anything but abstain is remarkable, and a long tradition beyond. It's part of the legacy of non-alignment. It's part of what now they call plurilateralism. This is a word that you will find in the book by Jay Shankar, the Minister of Foreign Affairs, a very interesting book that has not been sufficiently analyzed in the West. The Third Way is the title. I really recommend it. If you want to understand why India is not taking side, you'll see in this book that the idea is to engage each and every country. And I emphasize the each and every country, including Russia, including China, according to the interest of India. You pursue your interest irrespective of affinities in terms of values, in terms of ideology, according to the moment you're in, according to your real politic-oriented interest. So this is plurilateralism, which is the second explanation, and that comes as a legacy of non-alignment. But there is a third explanation that for me is possibly the most important one. Defense of democracy is not a priority of the Indian government. No, we have this impression that India has become a friend of the West, that there is a rapprochement that is now 20 years old with the US, and therefore it should have been normal, according to Washington or Brussels, that India should condemn an aggression, an invasion like the one we've seen recently. But in New Delhi, it's not seen in this perspective. Democracy promotion is not at all something the regime is valorizing, and largely because the Modi government does not share the liberal values we consider as key for any democratic regime. So for these three reasons, and again, I don't know really which one is the most important, but I think this is clearly a sufficient reason, a number of reasons for India to stay on the fence. Now, of course, the war is beginning. It will evolve, and India may adapt. But in this kind of real politic-oriented position, that I think is for sure.
Well, so I think there is a very strong element coming out together that both India and China are not subscribers to the old unilateral world with just United States in the role of enforcer of some world order, right? But can I ask you if this is the case, and this situation must have been known for a while. How do you explain the fact that that US and the West more generally allowed India to become so dependent on Russia for its military armament and the rest of it?
Well, I do think that the Western countries tried hard to help India to emancipate itself from this dependence. And arms sales lately we are very much on the advantage of Western countries. You know, the Rafale deal with France, so many very sophisticated equipment sold by the US as well, including the Poseidon aircraft, Israeli, very important Falcon radar system. But interestingly, Russians realized that India was shifting to the West, and Putin asked India, I guess, to get this S-400 deal precisely for continue to exert some influence. And on the Indian side, it could make sense simply because to put your eggs in as many baskets as you can is the traditional attitude of India, precisely for diversifying. But it has not diversified sufficiently for being independent from Russia at the moment, certainly. Yeah.
Right. And I think, your third factor is also a very great interest. You mentioned that, in fact, the values of the current Indian government are not exactly liberal democratic. And this reminds us of the fact that last year, both Freedom House and VDEM actually downgraded India's democracy. It used to be China clearly autocratic, but India clearly democratic, right? Was this downgrade of India, in fact, warranted? Do you support it? Do you think there was enough evidence to treat India, which is nevertheless a very complex country, I mean, for a democracy and for a country which managed to manage its multi-ethnicity and to still keep free elections? So these are performances. Was there enough evidence to warrant this downgrade to partly free?
Yes, it's a very complex situation indeed. On the one hand, you have one pillar of democracy that has survived, elections. This country keeps voting at the state level, at the national level. And so far, you cannot say that any election has been stolen. So this demotic dimension resist. But on the other hand, democracy is not voting only. And I would say we need now to qualify India's democracy from at least 3 points of view. One, electoral competition is not as fair as it used to be. It's not a level playing field. And it's not a level playing field because money power plays a big role. And the ruling party, the BJP, in 2019 for the general elections could spend something like $3.6 billion, which is an assessment, a reliable assessment by independent NGOs, which are doing this job for quite some time. Secondly, the distortion comes also from media coverage. And at the time of the election campaign, there is a significant imbalance, which makes, again, this election not at all a level playing field. So that's one qualification. More importantly, the second one has to do with the decline of key institutions. Parliament is not playing the role it used to play. The Election Commission is not as independent as it used to be. The Central Bureau for Investigation, CBI, is now also clearly playing in the hands of the government. And more importantly, the judiciary. The judiciary that used to be such an important pillar of India's democracy has lost some of its independence for many reasons, including the fact that judges have not been appointed by the government because they were known as not as pliable as others. And as a result, for the first time in the history of post-independence India, we have key issues not taken care of by the government of India. One example, the judiciary. One example, the Citizenship Amendment Act, a very important law in 2019 that introduced religion as a criterion for being eligible to citizenship. The new amendment said refugees from Afghanistan, Pakistan, Bangladesh who are Muslim are not eligible to India's citizenship. And this is before the court for 2 years. And third and last, and probably more importantly, democracy is not what it used to be because it has lost its multicultural dimension. India was a secular country. It's still on the paper, but it's not in practice. And we see minorities, including Christians and Muslims, at the receiving end, de jure, when you have something like the Citizenship Act transformed, but even more de facto. De facto because in the street, vigilante groups which are very active traditionally on the Hindu nationalist side, play a big role for promoting violence, all kinds of violence, intimidation vis-a-vis the minorities, against interreligious marriages, against also the mixing of people in neighborhoods. You have as a result a ghettoization process of minorities that is going on, and so on and so forth. I don't want to enter into too many details, but if you add up all these three dimensions, electoral authoritarianism, erosion of institutions, including, by the way, the party itself, because BJP itself has lost some of its power. And thirdly, what I call an ethnic democracy, a democracy where citizens are not equal, and this is the word, the notion samismo has coined for describing what's going on in Israel. You have some citizens who are more equal than others, de facto and de jure. Well, these three transformations make India a different kind of democracy for sure.
Yeah, I see. So in other words, this is a full description of a backslide, right? From all points of view, electoral and institutional and cultural. But don't we ask a little bit, too much of India by putting it this republicanist criteria? I mean, India is not France. And I recall that in December when President Joe Biden organized his democracy summit, Yvonne Krastev wrote an op-ed in New York Times saying that President Joe Biden is facing this difficult choice, with his democracy approach, because he looks at two categories of countries which are enemies of the United States and clearly opposed, right? And countries which can still be amenable to be friends or allies or partners of one way or another. And can we really treat them equally? In other words, it's a new paradigm of realism, which makes us ask ourselves, can we really be so harsh in our treatment of rating other people's democracies when in fact it seems that we really need allies in this region? I'd really be curious of the opinion of both of you. Are we entering the new phase of realism? Do you think that we can still promote democratic criteria as we used to, when clearly we have less influence to actually make it happen?
No, certainly. We have the West has adjusted de facto to this new situation because our governments do not draw any conclusion from the ratings in question. No, they have invited India to, Biden has invited India to his summit. None of the European countries say anything about human rights violations in India. So we have adjusted to our new influence indeed. And we try to engage this country as a potential ally. But the question we should ask ourselves is it a right investment? Is it a good investment? And for two reasons. One, no conditionality can appear as giving a certificate for impunity? Two, can we really expect India to be an ally? India has never been the ally of anybody. It is not taking side. It is not committing itself. It is not tying its hands vis-a-vis anybody. So we may expect to get something in return that we will never get, because it's not part of the paradigm, it's not part of the DNA of this country on the international scene. So the question, the debate that the Western countries should have is there for me, and nobody asked this question. I've never seen this debate really, for instance, in Europe, except maybe in the European Parliament. Maybe this is the only place where these two questions, shouldn't we be more vigilant, so to speak, vis-a-vis India on the human rights front? And secondly, can this country be really an ally? This is the only place where this debate has taken place, and it's not the place where decisions are made.
I see. Let's discuss a little bit the state of perhaps democracy is too much said, but yes, the state of democracy in China. We are all a bit terrified to see this heavy-handedness by which China manages the pandemic. Is this something that can, subtly serve as a democratizing factor in China? Do people like to be managed in this way by the regime, or this is such a perfect control that it doesn't have any influence at all? If perfect control exists, as somebody who was 25 and living in Ceausescu's Romania when the regime break, I really don't think perfect control exists. Things can really happen overnight, but it largely depends on context, okay? And definitely external context doesn't seem to favor democracy. Still, they're pushing people a bit hard, aren't they?
So I think I need to start a little earlier than the COVID pandemic in my response. So China has been undergoing economic reform for since 1978, and certainly a lot of the political science literature supported modernization theories, stating that economic reforms would over the long run actually lead to democracy. And China is one of the few examples of where modernization theory has failed. And increasingly, policymakers in Europe, but also in the United States, have come to the conclusion that economic growth in China is actually not leading to support for more democracy. In part, this is caused by China's gradual approach towards economic growth. So in contrast to Russia, or the Soviet Union, when the Soviet Union fell, Russia promoted reforms very rapidly, which then resulted in increasing support for a change in the political system, while China's gradual approach has resulted in over the long run, even though it created a lot of political and social problems, it also allowed the political institutions to adjust and undergo political transition without actually leading to a breakdown of the one-party regime. China is a one-party state, so also in political science here, I'm wearing my head as a comparative politics, a researcher of comparative politics in China. So in this discussion about democracy, a lot of the observers are often distinguishing between autocracies or non-democracy versus democracies. But since Barbara Geddes wrote a very influential article arguing or criticizing this view and arguing in favor of thinking about greater variation of autocracies and thinking about authoritarian states as differing more than just not corresponding to sort of the lack of elections and protection of civil liberties. Nowadays we think about autocracies in terms of military regimes. Many of the Latin American countries before democratic transition qualified as military regimes. Then personalist systems, which are oftentimes also supported by family ties. And then China constitutes an example of a one-party state where the Chinese Communist Party is leading the country. And so over time, a lot of the observers of Chinese politics have tried to explain why China is so stable. And there are a number of explanations. One is the one that you're hinting at, Alina, which is China's coercive capacity. And this is, of course, in the foreign press and foreign reports about China. This is very much how, for example, Europeans, when they look at China, they oftentimes look at China through the lens of what they have experienced. So they look at China through the lens of Nazi Germany. They also look at China, I'm talking here about, someone who's based in Berlin in Germany, or also possibly Eastern Europe. However, so coercion is only one, the coercive capacity of the Chinese regime is only one factor that supports its stability. In addition to that, there's certainly economic growth, which constitutes an important factor. Then increasingly, China scholars have also talked about so-called feedback mechanisms. So these are input institutions that China has created that allow the Chinese government to obtain policy feedback from citizens. And it is the combination of all of these tools that have resulted in actually a very strong support. So I conduct public opinion polls in China, although those have become increasingly difficult to do for foreign observers. But when we were still able to do them, the poll data actually show that even if you take into account that certainly some people will lie in public opinion surveys, because they may fear repercussions by the regime. So there is evidence that some of this is happening, but certainly not everybody in Chinese public opinion polls is lying. And even if you control for this so-called social desirability bias, what you will find is that there is actually a very high level of political trust and support for the Chinese political system. And now I'm making the loop back to your initial question about COVID. So certainly recently China, and this is also one of the reasons why China is less active, less proactive internationally, in my opinion at least, is that China increasingly domestically is facing criticism regarding its zero COVID measures. Shanghai, which is a city of provincial level status in China and has a population of the size of some of European countries. So Shanghai was under lockdown in several stages. The city was divided initially, and then the lockdown was prolonged. There has been a lot of criticism because some, the support so people were complaining online that they were going to bed hungry, that they weren't able to get delivery as had happened during the previous lockdowns, because the delivery teams or restaurants were not able to travel throughout the city. Also, the government was the Shanghai government intended to distribute food amongst the population, which didn't work as well as planned. There has been a lot of criticism of children being separated from their parents and so forth. Nevertheless, it is my opinion, even though there is a lot of criticism, and this is actually also tying to another domestic issue, political leadership selection, which I'm also happy to talk about if there's interest, which is coming up in November. So this criticism can also be connected to sort of factionalist policies that are happening within the Chinese Communist Party. But it would be a mistake to believe that those, in my opinion, that those issues will lead to a larger movement against the Chinese government, or even initiate a movement that would bring down the political system or in support of democracy in China. My current assessment is that there's still enough support for the Chinese leadership, also, as a result of these economic growth factors, as a result of these input institutions that actually stabilize China quite considerably.
So you don't think that a revolution will be started in Shanghai, a place where revolutions have started before, okay? It doesn't need to grow into a full revolution, but sometimes you just have cities which rebel, all right, and create an example. You rule this out, if I understand correctly.
Yeah, I mean, never say never. Timur Kuran wrote a very famous essay in political science about how revolutions are unpredictable, precisely because it's very difficult to study the extent to which a population is supporting autocracies. Nevertheless, I think if China had been unstable, to me, that year would have been 2008, not 2022, because in 2008, there were a lot of signs that traditionally mark dynastic decline. If you think about, pre-modern China, dynasties in China usually would undergo cycles, and then there used to be certain signals that were seen as signals for a dynasty that is declining. And those signals included high levels of corruption. They included natural disasters. In 2008 was the Sichuan earthquake. You may remember that there was a big earthquake that struck China at the time, and that really challenged also the state capacity of the Chinese government. And in addition to that, you also had a financial crisis going on. So you had not only regarding a pandemic, but you had on all sorts of signals pointed towards a challenge of the leadership, but still China remained stable. So if I had to bet, I would say no. This is not going to lead to a large scale revolution along the lines of what Timur Kuran may lead us to expect.
Right. So they're heading towards a nice Congress, right? I can tell you that that's what Ceausescu thought in 1989 when the 14th Congress was about to happen in November. He was absolutely convinced that all the challenges have been eliminated. Okay, but I don't want to be subversive on this. But what you said, I think, connects very well with what Christophe said before and brings to mind another interesting question. It does seem to me that one factor which makes this regime stable is nationalism, another of Christophe's actually areas of expertise. And then my question is, how is this Russian-Ukrainian war going to play? I mean, the fact that you see the West retaliating so strongly against a country of the size of Russia may scare some countries, and think that is anyway what the Biden administration hopes, that China is going to be scared, and they will want this not to happen to them, and that will make them refrain from certain policies. But on the other hand, cannot it have the paradoxical effect, in fact, rallying the people in these countries in support of their regimes, because people really do not like other countries to intervene and change regimes and change the course. So what role does nationalists play? Christophe, back to you.
Well, it plays a big role in the stability of the regime indeed. First of all, because nationalism, and even more what we call in political science national populism, helps to transcend class divisions, caste divisions. You can diffuse social tensions in the name of the national unity. And in the case of national populism, the nation is defined by the sons of the soil. The Hindus are the sons of the soil, and the minorities, Christians, Muslims, have foreigners. And you mobilize against these foreigners who are the, if you want, interior enemies, and sometimes fifth columnists. So that's key. And in this case, it's more religion than nationalism. It's as much religion as nationalism, and the mobilization of all kinds of Hindus, including low caste Hindus, who used to resent very much the domination of upper caste Hindus, has been really made easier by the emotions, religious emotions, which could be articulated in the name of the building of a temple in Ayodhya, for instance. I don't want to enter into the details, but this story of the temple has been very useful for many years, and those who know about this story will see what I mean. But I'd like to spend more time on the other side of your question, related to the Ukraine war, because indeed it's very paradoxical. What we've heard repeatedly in India is we don't want foreign interferences. We don't want foreign intervention. And in that sense, India and China are very similar. You know, they don't want sovereignty of countries to be affected by foreign interventions. And they were on the same page already when there were interventions in Libya, when there were debates about interventions in Syria. Incidentally, at that time, India was also a non-permanent member of the UN Security Council, and they also promoted this idea of non-intervention in the name of sovereignty. And that's an old story, post-colonial story. We saw it already in Bandung. We saw it already in the 50s. Very product.
If I may, however, this strikes me as a little bit biased, isn't it? I mean, I perfectly understand to be against intervention, okay, but is not the Russian invasion of Ukraine an intervention too?
This is exactly why I say it's paradoxical. That's exactly why I say it's paradoxical.
They're against Western intervention because they identify because they identify with people who can be in the, invaded by the West. Due to colonial reasons. Okay, understandable.
That's a very, very, very paradoxical attitude, but it is exactly that. And on the top of it, very interestingly also, you consider that the NATO forces were really provoking the reaction of Russia. That was, in that sense, legitimate. The idea that you would expand NATO till the borders of Russia. And secondly, we have heard Hindu nationalists saying, well, at least Eastern Ukraine is part of the Russian cultural sphere, and therefore they are rebuilding the natural geography that international law had distorted by recognizing some autonomy, some sovereignty to Ukraine. We've heard something very interesting, Akhand Russia, like Akhand Bharat. The idea of Akhand Bharat is one of the themes of the Hindu nationalists, saying we should reintegrate Pakistan and Bangladesh to India because the natural borders of our country goes that far. The natural borders of Russia, for some of the Hindu nationalists, go to at least the eastern part of Ukraine. So this is why, indeed, it's very paradoxical, because the one who has invaded the aggressive force appears doubly legitimate, because it was under the threat of NATO, and it was secondly reconstituting an historical, if you want, homeland for the regions. That's really something we need to ponder upon, because this is not the kind of discourse we can accept in multilateral arenas where international law is supposed to be the rule.
Daniela, the question on nationalism. I do not see any questions on chat. I would really like to encourage people, if they want to ask something, to rush on the chat in these last minutes of our conversation. So is the war helping the regime actually to rally people due to some anti-Western based nationalism?
Yeah, I'm glad you posed this question about nationalism. First of all, I want to say that I agree. So from a Chinese perspective, I would agree with Christophe's assessment about the importance of sovereignty in the mind of not only the Chinese leadership, but also in the Chinese public and its connection to China's past as a semi-colony. So other than India, which was of course ruled by by Great Britain, China was never ruled by foreign powers, but it was invaded by the British, by the French, and also by the Germans. And as a result of, in the face of military technological advancement, the last dynasty, the Qing dynasty, was so weak in response that we speak about China then becoming a semi-colony, a Chinese government that was very weak and dysfunctional. And that certainly also plays into the sort of historical memories and the so-called century of humiliation discourse in China that also feeds into Chinese nationalism. Nevertheless, Chinese nationalism is a double-edged sword to the Chinese leadership, because even though its origins, it may have been very much supported also by the Chinese Communist Party, it also created dynamics of its own. And there are a lot of examples, and actually part of my research also shows about how especially anti-Japanese sentiment, but also anti-American, strong anti-American and strong anti-Japanese sentiment actually constrained the policy options of the Chinese leadership. And as a result of it, what I have found in my work is that actually under the leadership of Hu Jintao, you had the government actually trying to censor and control two negative expressions of anti-Japanese and anti-American sentiment in the Chinese media. Now, I would like to see the extent to which this, I would like to see more of the empirical data as to the extent to which Chinese nationalism at the moment in this discourse is also sparked and manipulated by the so-called Umaodang, the 50-cent party members. These are paid bloggers that are also manipulating online public opinion, for example. And the kinds of, I would like to also see more information about the kinds of directives that are coming out of the cyberspace administration of China, in order to see whether in this particular case, the Chinese leadership is actually following the lines of Hu Jintao, which would be to actually try and contain too much expression of nationalism, or whether this is also supported by the official media. I haven't seen any good empirical research at the moment. And of course, one of the problems is that we don't have the kind of access that we used to have, and that we can no longer. And this is not only a result of the pandemic, this is also a result of, how foreign researchers are increasingly perceived to be dissidents and spies and not having an objective, unbiased opinion towards China. And therefore, we increasingly are losing access to the kind of information that would allow us to give a more informed opinion and answer your question.
Right. So actually signs of increasing closure on this front as well. Well, you know, as a comprehensive question, is there anything which can be done by the West? I mean, what I get from both of you is that, in fact, what we should try more is to understand this very different points of view. You know, I keep reading in Financial Times what Joe Biden told he when they met, or I don't know, it's always our news seem to be about what we tell them that they should believe. I think that maybe it would be a good idea to give bigger room to these very distinct positions and opinions that the people have and understand them a little bit better. But other than respect, okay, other than a little bit more respect and understanding, is there anything that we can do to gain them a little bit more to a world order based on international law and human rights?
Yes, oh, definitely. Well, the first thing to do is to be ourselves much more faithful to human rights and a value-based diplomacy, because you can't argue in the name of human rights and values if you do not follow these principles yourself. And I think it's one of the big issues we have to cope with. That's the number one recommendation I would make. The second one is to be united. We keep speaking about the West, but divisions within the West are really very damaging. You know, ERCAS is just the last episode. There are so many others. And Brexit is another example of the capacity Europeans have to get divided. And third, yes, to admit that the West cannot dominate the international relations the way it did for so many decades. It's now so evident, so obvious. And vis-a-vis China, for instance, I'm not at all a specialist, but this idea of containment, ideas which were there during the Cold War, seem to be completely outdated, because how can you contain a country you depend on so much? So you can diversify, you can balance, but you cannot contain, certainly. So to adjust to the new situation and to be somewhat realistic is another thing the West needs to do. If we do these three things, possibly we may continue to make our values, something we so dearly cherish, continue to help to prevail, but it's a big if.
Daniela?
Yeah, I want to respond to your question in sort of two steps. So so increasingly, I have noted that in the China debate, the debate outside of China is increasingly polarizing. So on the one hand, we have the sort of the panda huggers who are considered to be pro-China. And then on the other hand, you have the dragon slayers, the people who say, you know, we need to take a very strong stance against China and we no longer should be cooperating with China. It is my opinion, and also, you know, I'm teaching also a course on these questions, that the question about, you know, cooperating or taking a stronger stance is very much dependent on the policy issue. I believe we actually are in need to overcome this polarization, and we are in need of positions that promote a more nuanced view. And so my wish would be that in this discussion about China is that we do overcome this polarization and we actually start to evaluate China again, based on the empirical evidence that comes out of China. But that's also an appeal to the Chinese government to hopefully allow the data collection that is necessary in order to make those more informed empirical statements that allow for a more nuanced view. And then second, I think there's another question, which is, how do you deal with an emerging, a rising China that at the same time where a lot of there seems to be a lot of need for China to take a more proactive stance, actually, and especially in this, in this war. Certainly, the fact that China is not, even though China, I know, it has been, if you look at what the Chinese Ministry of Foreign Affairs is stating and so forth, it perceives itself to actually play a much more constructive role than it is perceived to be outside of China. So I do believe there's more actually happening behind the scenes between Putin and Xi Jinping that we know of. But it would have been my wish personally for China to engage more as a biased negotiator, because I'm going to post some links here in the chat. There's a lot of international relations literature that is pointing towards the success of peace negotiations if you do have biased negotiators on the table. And China, as a very close friend to Russia, would have been a very credible biased negotiator together with perhaps Germany and France. And I do believe that at least in some of the interactions that we've seen between Scholz and also Macron and Xi Jinping, there has been an effort on the side of Europeans to get China to actually join the table. I do believe, however, and this is, I think, relevant for both China, but also, the Europeans, that oftentimes Europeans do not quite understand the Chinese language that is being used. So they don't quite understand where the Chinese leadership is coming from. This is just my personal observation without being part of the room and actually knowing exactly what they say to each other. But then on the other hand, the European politicians also not using the right terms that could potentially move the Chinese position internally. And so this is an appeal for improving our knowledge about each other and for also trying to better understand each other's positions so that we can promote peace instead of more conflict.
Right, Daniela, I think there's a question for you on chat, if you can answer on chat. And I will pick up a question from chat also to Christophe for the ending of this conversation, which roughly is, I understand that an Indian minister has compared the Afghanistan war with the Russia-Ukraine war. How do they compare? I mean, is this comparison valid at all, and can it be perceived as a valid comparison, which allows us to put things a little bit in perspective? And on my side, I would add to this, do you think that things would have been different had the Americans not retired unilaterally from Afghanistan? We would perhaps have this situation of today or not?
Oh, I would respond to that first. No, the situation would have been very different. The Taliban would have never succeeded to take Kabul and to take the cities. So clearly, by withdrawing, they let the Talibanization of Afghanistan to take place. The parallel that Jaishankar made between the two is not very convincing for one simple reason. The US and the West at large withdrew from Afghanistan after 20 years of trying, not the best way, but trying to keep Taliban out of power. When on the contrary, India, by the way, never deployed any troop in Afghanistan, but that's a different story. The parallel would be would be convincing if India had tried to intervene in Ukraine, in this part of the region, and had made the invasion of Ukraine by Russia possible by withdrawing. And that's not at all, of course, what happened. But still, it's an interesting comment because it suggests that India felt let down by the West in Afghanistan. And because we let them down in Afghanistan, they don't see why they should care about Ukraine. You know, that's where the parallel makes sense and is revealing of a resentment vis-a-vis the West. India is looking at itself as encircled by enemies. Of course, there is China, but there is also Pakistan, a friend of China, and now Islamists, Taliban, who have always been seen as a major threat, and for good reasons, because they've been very active in, well, many parts of India, including Bombay, including Mumbai. So it's a very interesting comment in that sense. We are vulnerable. You let us down. Now, why should we care for your own priorities in Ukraine? I think we should try to understand this mindset.
Right. So we lost some trust, and we definitely lost a lot of influence in Asia that we have to somehow try to recover in the future. Thank you very much to both our speakers. This was very, very insightful. Thank you very much to our audience, and we will invite you again to another talk show in the month of May. Thank you, and have a lovely evening, everybody.
Thank you for having me. Thanks.
Bye-bye.
Bye.